The cold bite of autumn wind whistled through Willow Springs as Winifred Rose pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and face, the rough fabric scratching against the still tender scars that marked her from jaw to collarbone. The year was 1879, and the small Montana Territory town was the farthest she'd ever been from her Philadelphia home, exactly as she had intended. The stagecoach had deposited her unceremoniously at the dusty main street, just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountain peaks. Clutching her single valise, Winifred made her way toward the only establishment showing warm light through its windows, the Frontier Hotel. Her aunt's letter had promised employment there as a bookkeeper, and after everything that had happened, Winifred prayed that promise would hold true. "Rooms $2 a week, meals extra," said the stern-faced proprietress, Mrs. Holloway, barely looking up from her ledger. "Your aunt mentioned your skills with numbers, which I sorely need. You can start tomorrow." Winifred nodded, grateful for both the room and the position. "Thank you, madam. I won't disappoint you." Mrs. Holloway's eyes finally lifted, lingering momentarily on the scarf wrapped high around Winifred's neck despite the warmth of the hotel lobby. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The West ain't like back east, Miss Rose. People here tend to mind their own business." That night, in the small but clean room that would become her home, Winifred carefully unwound the scarf and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The angry red lines tracing her neck told a story she'd fled over 2,000 miles to escape. Her fingers traced the marks, some still raised and healing, others settled into permanent ridges across her once smooth skin. She'd survived, yes, but at what cost? The next morning brought routine and purpose. Winifred settled behind the hotel's small desk, reviewing months of disorganized accounts. The work was soothing in its predictability, each column of numbers fitting neatly where it belonged, unlike the chaos she'd left behind. Her scarf remained firmly in place, despite the warmth of the day. Several hotel guests gave her curious glances, but true to Mrs. Holloway's words, no one asked questions. For the first time in months, Winifred breathed a little easier. That peace was short-lived. "Madam, I believe you've made an error here." The deep voice startled her from her concentration. Winifred looked up to find herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I don't make errors in accounting, sir," she replied, straightening her posture. The man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that filled the small office, slid a receipt across the desk. "You've overcharged me by $3. Winifred examined the paper, her cheeks flushing when she realized he was correct. "I apologize, Mr. Waylon Colter," he supplied, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "Most folks just call me Colter." She counted out his change, hyper-aware of his steady gaze. As she handed over the coins, her scarf slipped slightly. Winifred quickly readjusted it, but not before she caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Thank you, Mississippi. Rose. Winifred Rose." She kept her voice professional, hoping he would take his money and leave. "Miss Rose." He tipped his hat. "I expect I'll be seeing you around Willow Springs." Later that day, Mrs. Holloway informed her that Mr. Colter owned the largest cattle operation in the county. "Decent man," the older woman said. "Fair with his hands, respected in town. Lost his wife to fever 5 years back. Raises his boy alone." Winifred simply nodded, pretending the information didn't interest her. But that night, she found herself thinking about Waylon Colter's kind eyes and the way they hadn't lingered judgmentally on her scarf. Over the next few weeks, Winifred settled into a comfortable routine. The ledgers were slowly becoming organized, and she found unexpected pleasure in the small-town rhythms of Willow Springs. Though she kept mostly to herself, she'd begun exchanging pleasantries with the regulars at the hotel restaurant where she took her meals. It was during one such meal that the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and Waylon Colter, accompanied by a boy of about 10 years. They took a table near hers, the boy chattering animatedly about horses. "Evening, Miss Rose," Colter called across the room, touching his hat brim in greeting. Winifred nodded politely, tugging at her scarf though it hadn't slipped. The boy, his son, clearly, with the same striking blue eyes, stared at her with unabashed curiosity. "Pa, why's that lady wearing a scarf inside?" the boy asked, his voice carrying in the small restaurant. Winifred froze, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. The room seemed to still as other diners paused their conversations. Matthew. Colter's voice was quiet but firm. Remember what we discussed about questions that might make folks uncomfortable? The boy's face flushed. Sorry, Pa. Winifred set down her fork, her appetite gone. She placed coins on the table and stood to leave, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. As she passed their table, Colter spoke softly. Miss Rose, my son and I ride into town every Saturday. We'd be honored if you'd join us for dinner next week. Surprised, she glanced up, expecting to find pity in his expression. Instead, she saw only genuine warmth. Still, she shook her head. That's kind, Mr. Colter, but I couldn't impose. Not an imposition at all. His smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. Just neighbors getting acquainted. Before she could formulate another refusal, young Matthew piped up. Please, Miss Rose. Pa says I need to learn proper manners around ladies. And Mrs. Holloway scares me something fierce. Despite herself, Winifred laughed a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in many months. Well, when put that way, how can I refuse? The smile that spread across Waylon Colter's face made something long dormant flutter in her chest. Saturday at 6, then. All week, Winifred alternately anticipated and dreaded Saturday evening. Several times she drafted notes to Mr. Colter declining his invitation, only to discard them. Why did this man's simple dinner invitation unsettle her so? Perhaps because, for the first time since arriving in Willow Springs, someone was looking at her, really looking at her, not just at the scarf she hid behind. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures. Winifred selected her best dress, a modest navy blue with lace at the collar, and as always, carefully arranged her scarf to cover her neck and jaw. The routine had become second nature, though the wool was uncomfortable in the warm dining room. Colter and Matthew were already seated when she arrived. The rancher stood immediately, pulling out her chair with a courtesy that reminded her of a different life. You look lovely, Miss Rose, he said simply. Dinner passed pleasantly, with young Matthew dominating the conversation with tales of life on their ranch. Winifred found herself laughing more than she had in months as the boy described his ongoing battle of wits with a particularly stubborn hen. She just won't stay in her coop, he lamented. Pa says she's got notions above her station. Sounds like a hen with ambition, Winifred remarked, earning a hearty laugh from Waylon. As they finished their apple pie, Matthew yawned widely. Sorry, Miss Rose. Been up since before dawn helping with the new foals. Perhaps we should get you home, son, Waylon said, but hesitated, looking at Winifred. Unless. Miss Rose, would you care for a brief walk? The evening's fine, and Matthew can wait in the wagon for a few minutes. Surprised by the invitation and by her own desire to accept, Winifred nodded. A short walk would be nice. They strolled down Willow Springs Main Street in comfortable silence. The setting sun painted the buildings in gold and amber, and for a moment, Winifred felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. I hope Matthew didn't overwhelm you, Waylon said finally. He doesn't get much chance for conversation beyond ranch hands and livestock. Not at all. He's a delightful boy. She smiled. You've done well with him. Waylon's expression turned wistful. I try. His mother would have done better, but... He trailed off, then changed course. Have you found Willow Springs to your liking, Miss Rose? It's very different from Philadelphia, but yes, I have. She hesitated. People here are kinder than I expected. The West has a way of stripping folks down to their essentials. Back East, too many judge a person by their clothes or their accent. Out here, it's what you do that matters, not where you came from or what you look like. His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Winifred's hand drifted unconsciously to her scarf. Waylon noticed, but didn't comment. Instead, he said, I'd like to call on you properly, Miss Rose. With your permission. Her heart thumped painfully. Mr. Colter, Waylon, please. Waylon. His name felt right on her lips. You're a respected rancher. I'm just a bookkeeper with a past I'd rather leave behind. His eyes, honest and direct, held hers. We all have pasts, Winifred. Out here, it's the future that counts. Before she could respond, a commotion from down the street caught their attention. 3 men on horseback thundered into town, whooping and firing pistols into the air. One rode directly toward them, forcing Winifred and Waylon to jump aside. "Damn Blackwell brothers," Waylon muttered, placing himself protectively in front of Winifred. "Been causing trouble since they drifted in last month." The lead rider wheeled his horse around, leering down at them. "Well, if it ain't the high and mighty Colter." His gaze shifted to Winifred, his expression turning ugly. "And who's this little dove?" "Didn't know you had a taste for damaged goods, Colter." Winifred flinched as if struck. The man had obviously seen something when her scarf had shifted during their hasty move to safety. Waylon's voice was deadly quiet. "Apologize to the lady, Blackwell." The man spat on the ground. "No apologies for speaking truth." What happened next occurred so quickly Winifred barely registered the movements. Waylon lunged forward, dragging Blackwell from his saddle. They crashed to the dirt street, Waylon landing a solid punch before the man's companions dismounted to join the fray. "Stop!" Winifred cried as the three men surrounded Waylon. She looked frantically for help, spotting the town sheriff emerging from his office. "That's enough." Sheriff Davis's authoritative voice cut through the scuffle. The men separated, breathing heavily. "Blackwell, you and your brothers head back to whatever hole you crawled out of. I've had enough of your disturbing the peace." The leader spat blood onto the dirt. "This ain't over, Colter." "It is for tonight," the sheriff replied firmly. "Move along." As the Blackwell brothers mounted and rode off, Waylon turned to Winifred, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "I apologize you had to witness that." "You're hurt," she said, reaching for her handkerchief. "It's nothing." His eyes softened. "Are you all right?" "What he said is something I've heard before," she interrupted, her voice tight. "I should return to the hotel." Waylon seemed about to protest, but nodded instead. "At least allow me to escort you." They walked in silence, the evening's earlier warmth replaced by tension. At the hotel entrance, Winifred paused. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Colter, and for defending my honor. But I think it best if we don't continue our acquaintance." Pain flickered across his face. "Winifred, good night." She hurried inside, not trusting herself to hear what he might say next. That night, sleep eluded her. Blackwell's cruel words echoed in her mind, but so did Waylon's immediate defense. No man had ever stood up for her that way, certainly not Edward, who had been the cause of her scars in the first place. The following days passed in a gray haze. Winifred threw herself into her work, staying late at her desk long after Mrs. Holloway had retired. She took her meals in her room, avoiding the restaurant where she might encounter Waylon. A week after the incident, Mrs. Holloway placed a small package on her desk. "From Colter's ranch," the older woman said, her expression unreadable. Boy brought it in. Inside, Winifred found a leather-bound book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, and a simple note. "Words that helped me after Clara died. Perhaps they might offer some comfort to you as well. W.C." That night, she read the poems by lamplight, pausing on lines underlined in pencil. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." The next morning brought rain and the unwelcome news that the Blackwell brothers had robbed the Willow Springs bank, shooting the teller in the process. The town buzzed with talk of a posse forming to track them down. "Colter's leading it," Mrs. Holloway informed her grimly. "Those Blackwells crossed the line this time." Fear gripped Winifred's heart. The Blackwells were dangerous men, and their leader had a personal grudge against Waylon. Without thinking through her actions, she grabbed her shawl and headed for the sheriff's office. A group of mounted men was just preparing to ride out when she arrived. Waylon sat tall on a powerful chestnut horse, checking his rifle. "Mr. Colter," she called, hurrying toward him. He turned, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Rose, please," she said, breathless from her run. "Be careful. Those men, they have a particular hatred for you." Something flickered in his eyes. "Hope, perhaps. I'll be back before you know it. See that you are." She reached up impulsively, touching his hand where it rested on his saddle horn. I'd like to discuss that book of poetry with you." A smile transformed his face. "I'd like nothing better." The posse rode out, leaving Winifred to an anxious wait. Hours stretched into an agonizing day, then two. News trickled in. The posse had tracked the Blackwells to an abandoned mining camp in the hills. Shots had been exchanged. On the third morning, Winifred was at her desk, though she couldn't focus on the numbers before her. The sound of horses brought her rushing to the window. The posse was returning fewer men than had left, some wounded. Her heart stopped when she didn't immediately spot Waylon among them. She ran outside, scanning the weary riders. Relief washed over her when she finally saw him at the rear of the group, helping a wounded man stay mounted. Their eyes met across the dusty street. His face was grimy, stubbled, with a new cut along his jawline. But his smile, when he saw her, made her breath catch. He handed off his charge to the town doctor and crossed to where she stood. "You're hurt," she said, echoing their conversation from days before. "It's nothing." His eyes never left hers. "The Blackwells won't trouble anyone again. 2 dead, 1 captured. I'm glad you're safe." The words seemed inadequate for the emotions churning within her. "I had something worth coming back for." He stepped closer. "That discussion about poetry?" "Despite everything," she laughed. "Perhaps after you've had a chance to clean up." "Fair enough." His expression turned serious. "Winifred, I meant what I said before. I'd like to court you properly, if you'll allow it." She hesitated, her hand reflexively touching her scarf. "Waylon, there are things about me, about my past. And when you're ready to share them, I'll listen." He gently took her hand. "But nothing you tell me will change how I feel." That evening, they sat on the hotel's back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. Waylon, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt, listened as Winifred finally told her story. "His name was Edward," she began quietly. "We were engaged to be married in Philadelphia. He came from a good family, was charming, well-respected." She paused, gathering courage. "But he had a temper. At first, it was just sharp words when things didn't go his way. Then came the accusations, the jealousy." Waylon remained silent, his steady presence giving her strength to continue. "I tried to break our engagement after he struck me the first time. That's when." Her fingers traced her scarf. "He said if he couldn't have me, no one would. He had a knife from his hunting collection." Waylon's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "My screams alerted our housekeeper. He fled, and I survived, but—" She swallowed hard. "The police did nothing. His family had influence. They suggested I had provoked him, that perhaps I'd even inflicted the wounds myself for attention. So I wrote to my aunt here, packed what I could carry, and left everything behind." When she finished, Waylon took her hand gently in his calloused one. "Thank you for trusting me with your truth. Now you understand why I keep myself apart, why I hide these." She gestured to her scarf. "May I?" he asked softly, his hand hovering near the edge of her scarf. Heart pounding, Winifred nodded. With infinite gentleness, Waylon unwound the fabric, exposing the network of scars across her neck and jaw to the fading light. She waited for disgust or pity to cross his features. Instead, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Don't cover what you survived," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Every one of these marks tells me you're the strongest woman I've ever known." Tears welled in her eyes as he traced a finger lightly along her jawline. "Out here, we all carry scars, Winifred. Some are just more visible than others." He showed her his forearm, marked with an old burn. "Caught in a wildfire my first year ranching. Nearly lost everything." He touched a jagged line on his temple, normally hidden by his hair. "Rustlers, 74. And here he placed her hand over his heart, is where Clara took a piece with her when she died. We all bear our wounds. The question is whether we let them define us." In that moment, something hard and protective around Winifred's heart began to crack. For the first time since the attack, she felt not shame but a kind of fierce pride in her survival. As spring yielded to summer, Winifred found herself spending more time at the Colter ranch. Young Matthew had taken to calling her Miss Winnie, trailing after her with endless questions about life back east and begging for help with his reading lessons. The first time she ventured into town without her scarf was a milestone marked only by Waylon's gentle smile of approval and Mrs. Holloway's brisk nod. A few townspeople stared, but most simply tipped their hats in greeting as always. "Told you folks here mind their own business," Mrs. Holloway remarked that evening. Besides, half the men in this territory got worse scars from barroom brawls. By autumn, Winifred had moved into the small teacherage behind Willow Springs' one-room schoolhouse, having accepted the position of schoolmistress. Her evenings were often spent at the Colter ranch, where she, Waylon, and Matthew would share dinner before sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge. On one such evening, with Matthew already asleep inside, Waylon took her hand. I've been thinking. A dangerous pastime, she teased, comfortable now with the easy banter they'd developed. Indeed. His smile faded into seriousness. Winifred Rose, when I lost Clara, I never thought I'd find love again. Then you arrived, hiding behind that scarf, but with so much strength shining through. Her heart began to race as he knelt before her, still holding her hand. I'm not a man of fancy words, but I know what I want, and that's a life with you. Will you marry me? Joy bubbled up inside her. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. He swept her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her feel both protected and powerful. When they broke apart, she touched her scars, once a source of shame, now simply part of her story. Matthew will be pleased, Waylon said, his eyes crinkling with happiness. He's been asking for weeks when I was going to make you his mother officially. They married as winter's first snow-dusted Willow Springs. The entire town turned out, Mrs. Holloway serving as Winifred's matron of honor. The bride wore no scarf, her hair swept up to fully reveal the marks of her past, not as symbols of victimhood, but as testament to her resilience. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As wildflowers carpeted the meadows around the Colter ranch, Winifred shared news that brought tears of joy to Waylon's eyes. They would welcome a child before the year's end. Are you happy here? He asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Matthew teaching their dogs new tricks in the yard. His hand rested protectively over her growing belly. Winifred thought of the frightened woman who had arrived in Willow Springs nearly 2 years ago, hidden behind a scarf and running from her past. That woman could never have imagined this life. Respected teacher, beloved wife, soon-to-be mother, and friend to many in town. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, she replied honestly, turning her face up for his kiss. In September, Emma Clara Colter made her entrance into the world, a healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. As Winifred cradled her daughter, Waylon sat beside them on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, Matthew peering in wonder at his new sister. She's perfect, the boy whispered. Just like her mama, Waylon added, kissing Winifred's temple. Looking down at their daughter, Winifred traced a finger along the infant's smooth cheek. One day, she would tell Emma about the scars she carried, not just the visible ones on her skin, but the deeper ones that had healed with time and love. She would teach her daughter that scars weren't something to hide, but marks of battles survived and strength discovered. Don't cover what you survived, Waylon had told her on that pivotal evening. Words that had changed everything, opening the door to a life fuller than she'd ever imagined possible. As twilight fell across the Montana territory, painting the distant mountains in purple and gold, the Colter family stood framed in the doorway of their ranch house, a testament to resilience, to second chances, and to the healing power of love that sees beyond scars to the heart beneath.